Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sheila Smith, and I'm the Senior Fellow here at the Council on Foreign Relations for Japan Studies. I am delighted to be here today. We're going to have a fabulous conversation about the U.S.-Japan relationship, but we're also going to situate that relationship in the broader issues of how to manage the global economy and how to manage the very rapidly transforming Asia-Pacific. Our gathering here today at the Council is a shared initiative. We have had the pleasure of welcoming Yoichi Funabashi of the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation, and he has brought with us a very high-powered team of Japanese experts. But we have worked very closely with Yoichi over the years. Dr. Richard Haas, our president, led a delegation of CFR members to Tokyo this February, and Dr. Funabashi and his institute hosted a very, very rich discussion with his members as well as a larger, broader audience of Japanese business and intellectual elites. So we're very grateful to Yoichi for all that he does for the Council and for the Japan program specifically. I wanted to say just a few words. I'm just back from Beijing and Tokyo. It is a moment in the region, I think, that is not only sensitive to the changes afoot in the Asia-Pacific, but I think it's a moment, too, where the U.S. and U.S.-Japan partnership needs a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, and a lot of really a deep dive into the way we see the world and the way we see the Asia-Pacific in particular. We have very deep common interests together. We don't need to reiterate them here. As I look out in the audience, I see lots of expertise. So I won't make the case for the U.S.-Japan partnership. It makes the case for itself. But I do think the world is changing quickly. And I think sometimes the perceptions in Tokyo and the perceptions in Washington we're looking at the same thing, but we're not always seeing it in the same way. And it's opportunities like this with experts like Dr. Funabashi and his colleagues, and that help us deepen a little bit our appreciation for the way those perspectives differ. That being said, I think in the end you'll find, and I think we'll find in both our conversation on the economy and our conversation on the rise of China, that you'll see that we have a lot of commonality in where we would like to see both the region and the world head. So I'm very excited about this. Let me also just invite Dr. Funabashi up to the stage for a few moments. Yoichi and I have known each other not as long as Dr. Haas and Dr. Funabashi have, but it feels like almost as long. He has done, I think, what very few people in Japan have ever been capable of doing, and that is he has led the conversation from outside of government on Japan's foreign policy and strategy. He has served as a member of Asahi Shimbun in Beijing and in Washington. He knows both China and the United States well, and he never hesitates to let us know what he thinks about our relationship, but as well as his views on the region. But he has also lately built this new think tank, the Rebuild Japan Initiative. He came out after the triple disasters in 2011 and put together an incredible array of support for this initiative. And I think it is Japan's only independent think tank. It's led, so he leads intellectually, but he also leads in terms of institution building in Japan, and we are always privileged to be his partner. Yoichi, welcome.
Well, Sheila, thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's great to see so many familiar faces. We are very much honored and humbled that you have taken time to join us for this critical discussion. Excuse me. Richard actually has been very much grateful for giving us this opportunity. We have known that the Council on Foreign Relations does not often jointly have a discussion session with other think tank. So I am extremely honored to share this stage with the Council on Foreign Relations. I also am very much delighted that two really heavyweights, Adam Posen and Shirashi Takashi, both of them being the authors to the publication which Sheila just mentioned, we actually published a report titled Examining Japan's Lost Decades in April in both English and Japanese. And Sheila has been a member of this Examining Japan's Lost Decade project from the start, and she also is leading author to the publication. We actually began a series of events featuring this theme and its relevance to the world, Japan's lost decades. In May, first at Harvard University, and then at Chatham House, then at the Australian National University. So this is the last leg for us to advocate our findings. Our think tank was established in the wake of Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. We actually set up a team of 6 members of independent investigation commissions and 30-some researchers made up of scientists, engineers, and lawyers, journalists, consultants, and former government officials, and the others, to provide investigative investigation into the causes and response of the crisis. The crisis itself was really the most severe national crisis, almost existential crisis in Japan's post-war history. It identified that underlying fundamental causes of that crisis, such as failings of crisis management, governance, and leadership. This examining Japan's lost decades, in a way, it was a sequence of this ongoing study. Our institute think tank stands out in Japan as our three pillars. 1, critical review. 2, independence. And 3rd, global outlook. So as we attempt to develop our think tanks into a really leading global player, the Council on Foreign Relations continues to provide us inspiration and a sort of first-class model. So it is once again a great honor for us to share this stage with the Council on Relations. And thank you very much.
So with that, let me give you a very brief introduction of what we're going to do today, and then I'll turn the floor over to our first panel. We will talk about 2 very particular issues. The first, of course, is going to focus on the state of the global economy, our national economic strategies, and the challenges we face ahead. The second panel will focus on our relations with the rising China and the geostrategic changes afoot in Asia Pacific. And then finally, our last session is going to be a conversation between Dr. Funabashi and Dr. Haas on the agenda for cooperation between the United States and Japan. You have the bios of all the participants in your handout, so we will not spend much time as presiders introducing people. We will go right into the conversation. So, Paul, thank you very much for your patience. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to today's Council on Foreign Relations initial panel here on the economics of Asia. My name is Paul Sheard. I'm the Chief Economist for Standard & Poor's, based here in New York. I'd also like to welcome the people that are on the live stream as well. So let me introduce the 2 panelists. As Sheila said, you've got the bios. This can be very brief, and I think both panelists are very well known to the audience here. Takatoshi Ito is the Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, the Business School at Columbia University, and also the Associate Research Director at the Center on Japanese Economy and Business. As you know, he's a very well-known economist both on Japan and Asian economies, and has been, over the years, a very prominent voice influencing economic policy in Japan. Adam Posen is the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., and Adam also is an extremely prominent international economist and has deep expertise on Japan as well as the Asian region. So I'm going to take the liberty of interpreting the economics of Asia, which is the topic here, as to be more the economics of Japan and its place in Asia, particularly with respect to China, so we can focus the discussion a little bit more. So let me start the conversation by first of all asking you, Tucker, about your evaluation of so-called Abenomics. It's now coming up to the 3-year mark since Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came back into the political limelight as the leader of the LDP, and then of course regaining the prime ministership in December 2012. And Prime Minister Abe really took seized the imagination, I think, of the world with his vision and energy and his communication of this Abenomics strategy. Metaphorically, the so-called 3 arrows. And just to remind the audience, the 3 arrows, of course, the first one being a very bold and aggressive monetary policy, which he had to implement through the Bank of Japan. But of course, he had the opportunity, Prime Minister Abe had the opportunity to appoint a new governor at the Bank of Japan. And the second arrow being flexible fiscal policy aimed at supporting the economic recovery. And the third one, of course, is the so-called growth strategy, really aimed more at the real economy, raising real growth through structural reforms and various policies to promote innovation. So here we are almost at the 3-year mark, Tucker. What's your evaluation of it? And particularly looking forward, how do you see the Abenomics agenda playing out over the next 1 to 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. As I see it, those 3 arrows, I think, have different achievements or different speed of trajectory to the mark. And first arrow is aggressive monetary policy to get the deflation, economy under deflation up to normal inflationary environment. And this is very important for the stimulating economy in the investment and get the fiscal situation better. And I'd say, this is almost achieved, right? So clearly it's not deflation anymore. And CPI, the inflation measure, there are several measures, so we have to be careful. But underlying inflationary trend is already in 1% range. The measured inflation rate you hear headline is around 0 because of the oil price decline. But this is technical thing, temporary thing, that as the oil price decline effects expires after 12 months, that it will go back to this underlying trend, which is around 1% and rising. So I'm optimistic about this getting out of deflation, which I would say already achieved, and going to the 2% target, which Mr. Kuroda, governor, clearly outlined. Second arrow, flexible fiscal policy, is a little bit tricky, right? Flexible means that when needed, counter-cyclical, temporary, short-term stimulus will be applied, which he did in the 2013, and 2014 was slightly less, and this year slightly less, and they're talking about supplemental budget again now, but I imagine that won't be a large stimulus. But in the medium run, everybody agrees in Japan that fiscal situation, the huge debt is already too much, and we need to get back on the path of the fiscal consolidation. And the first step was the consumption tax, which is a VAT tax rate hike in April last year, and which Prime Minister Abe did. And the second step is now delayed, but is scheduled in April 2017. And once this is completed, which Mr. Abe is saying that he will do it unless Lehman Brothers kind of crisis happens again, the VAT rate will be 10%. And this will be on the path of consolidation, avoiding the fiscal crisis. So if if Abe is careful to use this short-term counter-cyclical stimulus with intermediate, medium-term consolidation, I'm also optimistic. What I'm not optimistic, or cautiously optimistic, is a third arrow, which is the growth strategy. Okay, we have seen the growth strategy documents 3 times already: 2013, 2014, 2015. Every year in June it comes out, this documents, and it's getting fatter and fatter with more items on the menu. But we haven't seen the dramatic implementations in these 200-some items. And what we need is no more documents. Just implement a few of those or several of those and make impacts, impression on the economy. Those are the good ideas. And actually, I was on the Prime Minister's Council of Economic Policy, Economic and Fiscal Policy in 2006 when Mr. Abe was first time Prime Minister. And we crafted all those things, and FTA and agricultural reform and so on. And we are about to implement, and he quit. So when he came back and the third arrow was announced, oh, these are familiar. These are we created 2006. So I take some credit, and they're good ideas. Just implementation is a problem. So third arrow is still far away from the mark. Need to travel faster.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know who invented the metaphor, but the third arrow is, has been called 1,000 pinpricks or 1,000 needles, which you can interpret 2 ways. They're just pinpricks, or you could actually interpret to say there's a lot of them. So maybe they do add up to something. But Adam, let me ask you, a very similar question. Long-time observer of Japan, you've been involved in the policy debate. What's your overall evaluation of Abenomics to date, and more importantly, where you think this is all going?
Well, thank you, Paul. And before I respond, I want to say again, thanks to Richard and the Council for doing this, and especially to Sheila for continuing to fly the flag of the importance of Japan and U.S.-Japan relations, which is critical. And I also want to express my admiration for Yoichi Funabashi and the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation, because I run a think tank too, but I'm on a think tank that already existed. He built something in an environment where there's a lot of hostility, a lot of suspicion for independent thinking, and RJIF stood up after the triple disaster and really called Japanese governance into question in a substantive way. And I admire what you've done, so thank you very much. And in that spirit of niceness, I will actually be more optimistic on Abenomics in my assessment in future than Taka's been. I basically agree with him on the monetary arrow that they have gotten out of absolute deflation and things are going to continue to get better. I disagree with him some on the fiscal arrow. I think the performance so far is worse than it should be, but we can talk about that. But the biggest point of disagreement is I'm actually quite positive on the structural reforms. Anybody who's been working on Japan, and I'm actually a relative newbie compared to some of the people who've spent decades on US-Japan relations, is used to the idea that the US keeps coming up with these lists. The Japanese government and academics like Taka come up with these lists. There's always 10 million things to reform and nothing ever gets done. Well, I think that's unfair to what's happened so far. And I just want to feature 3 reforms that I think are truly substantive. First and most important is Womenomics. There are 700,000 women working in Japan now who weren't working as part of the workforce 3 years ago. That's in a workforce of around 52 million. That is a huge number. That is enough to offset demographic decline for 5 or 6 years. Now, some of those women are part-time, but we know from the Nordic countries that's part of how you keep women in the workforce, is you allow for flexible arrangements. They're certainly still discriminated against and paid less. That has been part of the problem with getting wages up in Japan, is because you have this influx of new workers, increasing supply, lesser paid. So as a transitional matter, it's actually worked against the reflation policy. But that, again, isn't unusual. We saw in Germany, they did huge labor market reforms 15, 20 years ago under Chancellor Schroeder, it took 3 or 4 years until the next recovery before you started to feel the benefits, because while you do the reforms, they're a drag on the economy. And that's what's happening in Japan. Womenomics is real. It's not getting rid of sexism, but it's a huge step forward. Second, corporate reform. It's not perfect, but some of the reason stocks are up in Japan isn't just a weak yen and luck. It's that you actually are unlocking value in some of the big companies. We've seen the pressures on Toshiba, Olympus, and others in ways that didn't exist before. Again, I'm not going to tell you this is a perfect stock market. Of course, the stock market here isn't exactly perfect either. It's that all these bound up, complicated companies where you couldn't really tell what was going on, the value is to some degree being unlocked, and that's part of the reason foreign investors are in. Third, agricultural reform. Now, we all know in the US we have the obscenity of growing almonds and rice in California and growing sugar here instead of importing it. So every country's got its agricultural foibles. But in Japan, everything was truly upside down. And Taka did some of the huge work on it, documenting how bad this has been for Japan. And in the context of TPP, but also domestically, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Deal, there's huge agricultural reform underway in Japan. JA, the semi-communist, semi-NRA collective that runs Japanese agriculture, is being disassembled at the moment, and we're not having to wait for all their 80-year-olds to die to disassemble them. If TPP goes through, there's going to be a huge change in Japanese agriculture. On my back of the envelope calculations, if this goes through the way it should, and whether or not it goes through is something we'll come to in a minute, it's going to save $1,000 plus per year for Japanese households in terms of reduced costs of food. That's a big number, and it's huge symbolically. So I don't think we should be as skeptical. Let me make one final point, Paul, I'm sorry. You know, we go around, we look at Europe, and we always have the laundry list. Greece should do the following 20,000 things. Italy should do the following 20,000 things. Spain actually does 5 out of the 20,000 things. Japan, yeah, we've all been complaining for years, but there is real progress being made. And it's not a question of glass half full, glass empty. It's a question of these are things that will meaningfully raise the growth rate, which is the goal. And I think we should acknowledge that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. Very useful perspective there, particularly on the so-called growth strategy, the third arrow. I'm going to come back a little to where we sort of started with the monetary and the fiscal. And I guess I'm a little bit more wary than both of the panelists here, I think, on the, has Japan decisively exited this secular period of deflation? I mean, you could look at the index numbers. Yeah. The GDP deflator now, is in positive territory. That is helped a little bit by rising, falling oil prices, just arithmetically through the GDP relationships. It tends to help the deflator. And CPI, I think the one that I would look at is the so-called core yep. CPI, which nets out food and energy, and that's 0.8, and that has been trending up. So yep. I think that this really miraculous shift in policy at the Bank of Japan, has had a dramatic effect, and it's moving in the right direction. Although I would have to say the markets are looking for more, right. Even though what the Bank of Japan is doing is pretty big, pretty stupendous. The markets always want more, and of course it's open-ended, so even if Mr. Kuroda does nothing, the balance sheet still expands. Right. I think that point is sometimes lost on people. But maybe more on the fiscal side. If you look at the Japanese economy, last year it did go into recession, technical recession, you might call it. And, I think everybody thought this year would sort of pick up quite nicely again. We had a negative quarter in the second quarter. And a lot of people are saying, the third quarter could have been slightly negative as well. We'll get that data soon. But looking back on that consumption tax hike of last year, which, there was a big debate running up to that, and you were both involved in it, I was involved in it. And there were sort of two sides there. But some people were saying, look, it's okay, it's not going to have much effect on the economy, let's go ahead. Others were saying, look, let's nail ending deflation first things first, and then proceed with fiscal consolidation. But a two-part question, again back to you, Taka. Looking back, do you think that was a policy error? Or knowing what you know today, do you think that that was the right policy decision? And then looking forward to April 2017, do you think that that should be made contingent on economic conditions, or whether it should be kept on a kind of autopilot, as Mr. Abe has done at the moment?
Okay, so it was not a mistake, and it should have been raised. It did, and yes, the downturn was more than I expected. Everybody expected. So there is something about consumption not coming up. But this may be due to consumption tax increase, perceptions of it, or something else. And we don't know. We can run the experiment. But waiting till growth rate comes to 2% and in inflation rate 2% and old normal situation, it may not come. So we need to have this medium-term trend consolidation. If it goes down a little bit, you can do the stimulus, short-term stimulus, to back it up, the consumption going down by government expenditure, which government did. So we should keep this medium-term consolidation to avoid future fiscal crisis out there. And if there is a cyclical thing, we apply the cyclical, counter-cyclical fiscal stimulus. 2017, we should do it.
Adam, you've done a lot of work on Japan's fiscal situation. The numbers, when you throw the headline numbers out there, government debt on a gross level to GDP, I think is around 240%. That sounds like an astronomical number. The fiscal situation is improving, but Japan is still running budget deficit, so that that continues to almost by definition move up. The net debt situation, which I suspect economists like yourself would focus in on, I think is much better. I think it's probably around 130% or so, depending on the calculation, but still much higher than other countries. What's your view on Japan's sort of fiscal outlook? Is Japan is a fiscal crisis, so to speak, almost baked in at some point, or is there some kind of exit strategy for Japan from this fiscal situation?
I think, Paul, what I've been saying, and along with Taka, I don't think the surprisingly bad results of the consumption tax hike really change anything. I mean, it's a sad reality, but it doesn't change the underlying facts. I think Japan is on a path, not of a fiscal crisis the way, say, a Greece or an Argentina is, because they don't have foreign debt and they don't have foreign denominated debt. But they are on a path where they're going to be forced to make a lot of domestic adjustments, a lot of quick cuts in things they don't want to cut if they're not careful. Because even at, I agree with you, net debt to GDP of 130%, that means if interest rates go up even a little bit above 1%, then very quickly interest payments balloon to become a huge part of the budget. And if inflation works, interest rates have to go above 1%. Yep. So, it's not that they'll run out of money in the literal sense, it's that they're going to be having to pay all these interest bills and they're going to have to cut something else. And you don't want to do that. So I agree with Taka. The share of taxes in the Japanese economy is actually very low, partly because of bad collection, partly because just politically it's never been put up very much. So there's a lot of room for them to have a significantly higher share of the economy going to taxes. I mean, they're much lower than even the US, certainly compared to Europe or other Asian economies. So the question is, how can you get on this path? And here I'm going to be the unrealistic economist in a sense. If you really want to do this right, Taka has done one set, the OECD's done another set, the IMF, Mitsuhiro Fukao, various people have done calculations. If you're going to avoid having large cuts in benefits and things, you need to get the value-added tax, the consumption tax up somewhere above 20% in the long term. Some people say it needs to be 25, 22. I mean, let's not get it, but you have to get it at least up above 20%. And if you need to get from 8 to 20, it would be better to do it a little bit at a time for a long time. And so when we have this situation in Japan where every couple of years it jumps up by a large amount, you're shocking the economy. So you mentioned earlier, I think it was the term autopilot. In an ideal world, it would be like indexing. They would just sort of say, well, every year, it's just on a continuous basis. Every 6 months, up 0.5, up 0.5, up 0.5, irrespective of who was in government. And that would also have an inflationary benefit because it would convince people prices are going to rise. Now, for political reasons, that seems to be unrealistic. But it just tells you that every time they put it off, they're more likely to have to do a bigger jump and fewer scales, which is worse.
We agree too much. I think you should speak up.
Yeah, you should tell us why we're wrong. You should tell us why we're wrong. Taka and I are in agreement for the most part.
Right. Well, I'm going to leave that to my sovereign debt colleagues at Standard & Poor's. But I do want to I think the answer really is nobody really knows how all of this is going to play out. I mean, personally though, I think we're seeing with the QQE of the Bank of Japan, what could happen in the future. I mean, I think the idea that Japan is going to again run out of money in that sense looks slightly implausible, because for that to happen, the part of the government that has the electronic printing press that can create yen with a tap of a keystroke, that is the Bank of Japan, would have to say, I'm not going to press that keystroke. And I think that's somewhat implausible. But of course we know from history and other, from even analytics, that doesn't solve the problem necessarily. Maybe you need, maybe you end up with inflation. So we may be sitting here in 20, 30 years' time talking about Japan's uncontrollable inflation, and we will look back and say, in my youth, we used to talk about Japan's deflation. So,
But just to flag that, because you mentioned the monetary, and I don't want to delay us getting to the audience, but just 2 quick points for you guys to comment on. First is, I think one thing that where I've certainly had to change my views, and I think people in general are starting to have to change their views, is literal deflation isn't quite as bad as we thought it was. I hate to go all the way to the BIS where they like deflation, I'm not there, but that if you look back at per capita GDP growth the last 10, 15 years since the Koizumi government in 2002, actually it's pretty good in Japan. And so the deflation didn't spiral downward, didn't have as much bad effect as we thought. It probably hurt, but so I wouldn't get too caught up in that. But the second thing is the challenge when you talk about monetary policy, and again, you guys should come in on this, but I think the challenge from the BOJ's actually had more traction in some sense with its policy the last couple of years than the last couple rounds of QE from the Fed or from the Bank of England, despite the absence of crisis. Usually the excuse like Kevin Warsh will say, well, QE works in a crisis and doesn't work in normal times. And actually in Japan, it's actually made some progress. But there is this fundamental question of, if you have everybody pushing in the same direction, government, Bank of Japan, everybody pushing, and you still don't get inflation, there is something going on there we don't fully understand. And that's true in the US and Europe as well as Japan.
Well, I think we can come back to this topic in the Q&A, because I do want to pivot to China now and get your views on China. China now, of course, as we know, is the second largest economy in the world, just on a nominal GDP basis. But on the PPP calculation, purchasing power parity, it's actually edged ahead of the US. So on any reckoning, it's a major economy now. And China's performance since the financial crisis has been absolutely incredible. If you just look at average GDP growth since fourth quarter of 2008, it's 8.4%. Now, it's slower now, but imagine that in this most challenging economic time since the Great Depression, the world's second largest economy grows at above 8% consistently. So this is really dramatic, almost doubled in that period if you do the math. Now China is slowing, and this year has sort of been the epicenter of, I think for the first time, a kind of global economic shock. Certainly the markets took that way. Some events, equity market, and then around the exchange rate that were widely regarded in the markets at least as being policy missteps. Is the gloss coming off Chinese policymakers? As we speak, the fifth plenum, I think, is still continuing, maybe winding to an end in Beijing, and news is coming out to the one-child policy being kind of scrapped, lowering the growth rate for the next 5 years. The target has been lowered, I think, according to reports, to this strange number of 6.53. Adam suggested 5 plus 3 equals 8. That's auspicious, so there's something going on there. But Tucker, turning to you, I'd love to get your take on China. First of all, the Chinese economy per se, and then perhaps we'll talk about Japan's strategy towards China. What do you think's going on there? Are you a China bull, China bear? How do you put it together?
Well, the growth rate slowdown as the per capita income rise is natural process, and we call the convergence in the growth theory. That is happening. We experienced in Japan and 10% in the 50s, 60s, went to 5%, 80s and 90s, it's a miserable 1%. ASEAN country, Korea, Singapore, ASEAN country, all did this as income goes up, per capita income goes up, growth rate comes down. And this is a natural process, and China will have 5% growth rate in 5 years, 10 years, and go down to 3%. But so I don't put too much weight on this slowing down Chinese economy, and that they have to get used to it. We have to get used to it. And the most serious matter is that, can we trust that number, right? So some people say that this is actually 5% instead of 7%. And they have to come clean on how they estimate and reports the numbers. And I think the shock was not only the growth slowdown, but the mishandling of the stock market, mini crash, and also currency policy. And I have serious doubts about how they see those market forces and how they can manage those market forces.
Thanks very much. So let me go to you, Adam, on that point. Tucker made the point that it's natural that the GDP growth should slow down as the country gets bigger and bigger. Of course, per capita incomes, though, in China are still relatively low.
Yeah.
I think around about $8,000 US. I think per capita GDP here in this country is around about 55,000, something like that. Japan's probably up in that bracket somewhere. So the conundrum, I guess, with China is it's become a huge economy
Right.
before it's achieved per capita,
Right.
middle income or developed world status. How do you see, or do you think that China is going to be able to manage this sort of transition to the next stage of its economic development, which is going to require major reforms, major change of sort of the rules of the game in the economy? And you could, I don't want to take the words out of your mouth, but you could view the so-called policy missteps in the first half of this year with the equity market and then with the exchange rate as being really kind of collateral damage that was done because China was actually trying to pursue a reform agenda around the financial system, which is absolutely mission critical.
Yeah. I tend to take a more positive view, both current and medium term. I'm very influenced by my colleague at the Pearson Institute, Nicholas Lardy, who I think has made a pretty persuasive case that A, the slowdown in China right now is not the middle income trap kicking in, that it is a short-term adjustment. B, that the kinds of changes you're talking about, Paul, and you're absolutely right, they're what's necessary, are pretty much underway. I mean, what part of Nick's analysis is using a variety of data to show that the service sector has continued growing. The service sector creates more jobs per unit per capita, twice as many as the industrial sector, that credit is going primarily to the new private industries and to services. That not everything's wonderful. I mean, when I say credit is going to these new things, that doesn't mean they aren't evergreening bad loans to the old state-owned enterprise sector, something Japan's very familiar with in a different form. So there's problems there, but I agree with Nick. I think that there is a more of a transformation going on. And I think the, frankly, screw-ups on the stock market and the exchange rate communication are things that have to be taken seriously, but they're not fundamental things. I just, talking about the medium term, you phrase it very well about them being very large without yet per capita very rich in China. And I think another way to look at that is the question of what's the frontier in the old American sense? How much of the economy do you have left to bring into the formal economy, to bring into urbanization and so on? And I think there again, Nick and others have argued, and I find persuasive, including some Chinese scholars, there's still a good 30 to 40% of the population to go. And it's not like everybody who could in the Northwest has already moved to Shanghai and has a job as a stock trader. There's a lot left to do. And so I think that that's another reason to expect it to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Staying with China for a moment, Tucker, looking sort of perhaps not within China, but what China is doing outside China. Clearly, they have not just this domestic reform agenda, but a reform agenda which probably has geopolitical dimensions, but economic development dimensions, obviously. I'm talking about such things as the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which they've launched, which Japan did not join, the US did not join, I think Canada did not join, but many countries did. The BRICS Bank, which has been a little bit in the shadows, but I think that process is going ahead. A lot of talk about this sort of one belt, one road, concept of kind of infrastructure developments, really sort of from China all the way through the Middle East and South Asia, Middle East, way into Europe. Very ambitious kind of infrastructure development plans. Trying to get the renminbi into the IMF SDR, the special drawing rights, which sounds all very esoteric, but there are 4 currencies in that basket, the sort of international currency of the IMF, the dollar, sterling, yen, and euro. And it does look like we're on the cusp of the IMF deciding to allow the renminbi in as well, which, you know, is a little bit controversial in some quarters, but would be, I think, a huge badge of honor for the Chinese in terms of saying, we've really arrived in terms of renminbi being acknowledged. And I think that would probably be a bit of a prize or reward for the reform elements in China as well. So my question really is, you know, how do you see China's sort of international economic strategy developing? And, you know, coming back to Japan, what's Japan's strategy in all of this? How is and how should Japan itself, more on the economic side than the political side, I think we'll get to that later, be engaging with China and the rest of the world around this emergence of China as this economic and international powerhouse?
Yeah, I think, Paul, you explained it very well, that Chinese strategy of expanding its economic sphere of influence. And I think that, you know, there is great enthusiasm about renminbi getting into SDR. I was in Beijing last week, and they're very enthusiastic about this internationalization of renminbi, and they'll do any reforms to get the renminbi to be used outside China. And you know, frankly speaking, that I think they are succeeding in internationalization of renminbi better than yen internationalization we tried to do in the 90s. And so in a sense, I think in Japan, it's almost of the resignation to the rise of the power of China, economic power of China. I think political issues we deal in the next session, but I think, you know, Japan has to live with it, and I think the you know, still it's third largest economies, and Japan should use those powers wisely. And that means that, you know, again, the 3 arrows should be succeeding.
Let me put you on the spot, if I may take the liberty. Do you think Japan should join the AIIB? Do you want to go on the public record on that?
I'm already on the record in Japanese writing that I was against joining AIIB. The AIIB was framed by China as Chinese will take the #1 voting share, headquarter location, and the top position. So the moment they proposed that the regional members collectively take three quarters, outside members only 1/4, means that the Europe and US at most 1/4, and within 3/4, China is more than half. So by announcing the framework, they are already #1 in the governance. So they can do anything, right? And they also said, you know, no permanent, no resident board, which means that, you know, all the important decisions are made in the headquarters in Beijing, and they circulate for the rubber stamps for approval in the non-resident boards. So this is by design. It's Chinese bank by China and for China. So I said, you know, if this design is not changed, then Japan has no reason to join. We have ADA, you know, Asian Development Bank, ADB. So we should help ADB instead of, you know, getting into this AIIB.
So we've got sort of two cross currents here. You know, China joining different things, China setting up parts of architecture that others, some join, some don't. But one important emerging part of the international trading architecture is the TPP that you mentioned, Adam. And of course, China is not a negotiating member or founding member of TPP. How do you see TPP fitting in, and can TPP actually be successful without China's participation at some point?
Well, so let me step back and put this a little bit, as you put it, to talk about what's the strategy. So in Japan's case, I think we all have to remember that Abenomics wasn't motivated by economics. Abenomics was fundamentally about Abe and Aso and other people who cared a lot about foreign policy and Japan's role in Asia to say, we need to have enough economic oomph and stability that we will have a voice in Asia for at least a while. And that if we don't have that kind of economic attractiveness to others, whether as an ally to the US or to other nations in the region, and money to spend, we're not going to be able to have a say in what happens to us. So remember, Abenomics is fun. They otherwise would have been happy with where the economy was, or not so unhappy. Abenomics is fundamentally about allowing Japan to be out there, and we're seeing that. In the US case, and this I think is more a question of congressional failures than of the Obama administration, I think we have to recognize that the lack of effective strategy is causing the problem. So the AIIB became something that opportunistically China could make something out of, because the US not only took a bad diplomatic tack in sort of ham-fistedly dealing with this, but is doing this against the fundamental background of, we haven't reformed the IMF, put in the money that the US promised it would do, put in the reallocation of shares in the spirit that Taka spoke about, so that Asia is fairly represented in the IMF. We haven't fulfilled our obligations in any sense. In 2010, the US government signed an agreement that we would do that, and the US Congress has failed to pass any of that, and the Obama administration, here I do criticize them, has been ineffective or cowardly in forcing the Congress to do that. And so that gives just a huge opening in the whole area of BRICS Bank, AIIB, and SDR for China to come up with this stuff, and gave them years in which to build this stuff up. So I think a lot of it is opportunism on China's part, which I don't like, but I can fully understand and respect, when the US has failed to deliver on its basic obligations as running the main international financial institutions. So then when we get back to this issue of China's doing different things, I do want to pick up on what you said. I think it's absolutely right. The place where the US is strongest in terms of international economic leadership now is trade. And which is a crazy thing to say, given the way Congress is, given the fact that Secretary Clinton decided to kowtow to the unions, and I'm using the word kowtow in this context consciously, and make noise against TPP on a garbage non-issue, because even after she knew the whole strategic reasons for doing it and helped formulate it. And I'm attacking Secretary Clinton on that because it's such a disappointment and a reversal. And of course, any Republican worth their name who's anti-free trade doesn't deserve to be out there at all. So, you know, this is obscene. Now that said, it's all about relative. And the relative offer China has on trade to the rest of the world is, of course, infinitely worse. They have no standards, no respect for intellectual property rights. They always want to try to leverage other people's materials and technology and patents whenever people invest there. They are not horrifically more bullying than other countries when they invest in places like Africa or Central Asia, but somewhat. So it's not like they're the desirable purveyor of money and influence. You know, and so when you have TPP, assuming the Congress stands up for the American interest in the full sense and stands up for American consumers, when we pass TPP, you have something that's genuinely attractive. And Japan, as I indicated with agriculture, it hasn't gotten rid of all tariffs on rice or on pork, but has made huge strides. And it will be opening its markets basically more than anybody else in TPP, and that's where the money is. That's what's actually making TPP go, is the opening of Japanese markets to US standards. Mm-hmm. And then you pull up Vietnam and Chile and everybody else, and potentially Indonesia, Philippines, and others who want to get in now. So this is the best possible avenue the US has in its hand at the moment, because it's where China is weakest, it's where Japan and the US are best aligned, it's where the US has the most positive offer. Now there is an issue, you don't want this to be anti-China. There are people who are going to sell TPP in Congress and in public as, oh good, we're encircling China, all these lovely democracies and quasi-democracies, and we're excluding China. That's wrong. What you need is open regionalism, saying if China's willing to meet these standards on human rights, on intellectual property, on labor, on environment, on adjudication of disputes, then they can join. And that's a very high standard, and China's not going to be able to meet that anytime soon. But it's the right way to go. You say, you want to do this? Do it. And to China's credit, and here I actually sincerely have to give them credit, not just opportunism, they've been very mature over the last 2 years in their treatment of TPP. They keep saying, well, we're doing our own thing, which is called RCEP, which frankly isn't even worth the acronym. But anyway, we're doing our own thing. You can do your thing, just keep us apprised, don't exclude us. And even very recently, they just came out again and said, we someday want to join TPP. And my colleagues, Gary Huffbauer, Sean Miner, and Fred Bergsten all came out with a strong advocacy for bringing China into APEC and TPP if they meet the standards. So to me, this is the biggest win in foreign economic policy we can do in Asia. And again, the burden's on the US. If you simply Congress bloody passes this thing, it will all cascade nicely.
Was that a technical term?
Which one, bloody or pass or TPP?
Okay, thank you very much. That was very, very passionate and persuasive. So at this point, I'd like to bring the members into the conversation, and also like to remind everybody, as we said, this is on the record. So we'll have a microphone. Please wait for the microphone to come. If you could state your stand and then state your name and affiliation, and also keep to one question. So the lady down here, I think, is the first member.
Betty Mushroom, Gear Holdings. In Japan, the aging of the population and the zero immigration policy, except for jobs that are dirty and dangerous, has led to more women entering the workforce. But once they enter, they're not promoted like the men. And when I've questioned this with this largest retailer in Japan that I've worked with for over 30 years, they say it's cultural. Now, do you think that they're going to do something about their culture? Or when are they going to recognize the role that women could bring to the economy?
Do you want us to respond, or you want to collect some questions?
No, I think we'll just respond one by one. So maybe Tucker, you could start with that, but perhaps I could just, while you gather your thoughts, just frame it a little bit more. You know, it's often said there's no immigration, you know, there's no population strategy. One of the things that's been you know, sort of interesting to me watching these thick reports piling up, as you mentioned, you know, the first report, the second report, the third report, is that slowly it has been moving in the direction of recognizing that Japan does need to do something about its declining population. Mm-hmm. In the most recent report that came out, I think it's called Abenomics Round 2, the idea, population in Japan is about 127 million at the moment, peaked I think at 128 in 2008 and 10, around that period. Mm-hmm. But according to many of the government projections themselves, it's slated to fall below 100 million, I think by 2048, according to one of the simulations. And the government has come out and more vocally said now they have a target, a policy to keep the population decline below 100 million, and it was above 100 million, don't let it go below. And for the first time there was a target introduced on the fertility rate, the birth rate, to try to lift that from 1.4 to 1.8. So if you could also address, you know, is this area of policy and thinking in Japan actually on the move, but can it ultimately succeed without some deep cultural changes, as the member was querying?
I think Paul, you hit right questions, sub questions. You know, I think the question had you know, immigration problem, women problem, and you know, promoting women problem, and the keeping the career for the women problem. So some questions are, is Japanese government allowing more immigration, more people to come? The answer is yes and no. First of all, immigration is a forbidden word. It's called foreign workers in the Prime Minister's office. So are we promoting more foreign workers? Answer is yes. And the stated goal is that, you know, anybody who has high skills are welcome. If you have a PhD, you're welcome. And but also stated policies is that we don't need unskilled workers. But in fact, unskilled workers are coming into Japan in the name of students and the trainees. And Japanese universities have many foreign students, and they're allowed legally to have part-time jobs up to 28 hours a week. And this is outrageous. They're not studying in the Japanese universities, but they're doing part-time jobs in restaurants, the convenience store cashier, and so on. So you see proliferation of the foreign workers de facto. Okay, I think it's much better to have more legal framework for part-time, not part-time, but the full-time workers, foreign workers who want to come to Japan and work. We should welcome for any job skills, because we are in shortage of workers. And if we don't allow those workers, they find a way to come in, like student status. That's not good. So I'm all for increasing foreign workers in any job skills. Now, there are some job skills, job categories, which we are already finding sharp shortage of the workers, and then government is doing something to allow them. But I'm not going into detail, but it's a long way to go. Women, I don't. If it is a culture, its culture is changing, and I think clearly the women are promoted, and womenomics is succeeding, as Adam says, and there are almost like affirmative action in Japan. So this is changing. The part that I think we need to do a lot is this fertility question. It's not just raising fertility. It's not policy, but we to have more babies. But the couples do desire to have two children if they are asked in the survey. We should be realizing their desire. And so 1.88 is probably a good number, but the government should go into the details that why it's not happening, why the desire of the average couple is not realizing, and one is that it's awfully difficult for women to continue the work when they have the baby. So as Adam pointed out, this the M-shaped curve, which is there's a drop in the women labor participation in the age bracket of 25 to 40. This valley is getting shallower. That's good, but maybe they're doing the part-time job instead of keeping the career job for to continue accumulate human capital. So we have to devise the ways that women can keep the same job throughout the child bearing and caring years. And that's where government is still failing, I would say, that we need more child care, nursery, and maybe foreign nannies and foreign household help. And that's the area that we need most.
Unless you have something else.
No,
okay,
that's
so
fine.
I'll go to the next question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mahesh Kotecha. My question is regarding the AIIB. You took a strong position on that. In fact, if you look at other regions in the world, in Latin America, for example, there's Corporación Andina de Fomento, where U.S. doesn't have much of a role. There are other regions. African region has many smaller development banks. So I think it's completely normal for a large region to have a bank that is regional, where the participation of OECD countries is limited. So why object to AIIB? Why not participate and influence through soft power the policies such as environmental issues and other governance issues by being a part of it rather than being outside of it? I think it seems to me U.S. made a mistake, and so is Japan making a mistake. Why would you not reconsider and participate to bring more kind of international best practices to the Chinese dominated bank?
Right. So what you described is I would categorize into the investment bank rather than multilateral development bank. And when you talk to Chinese people, they say EIB, European Investment Bank, is a model. And the model means that not having resident board, and they decide they mutually invest each other. So EIB has basically EU members, and they do invest in Germany or France, those high-income countries. So it's not development assistance, multilateral development bank, but the similar income level, similar economic structure, and they invest each other for when they identify infrastructure thing. I don't think Chinese idea of this AIB is not like EIB of friendly nations, similar economic development status nations to invest each other. It's much more like Chinese putting money into the infrastructure with others to the Central Asia and South Asia and others. That's much more geopolitical implications. And for that, I think, again, going back to the governance issue, that we need a governance to say this investment project is worthwhile and not violating environment standard and civil rights and so on. So I'm not against Japan, US joining AIIB, but to do that, to join, we need this governance structure within the AIIB to be reformed. So once it's reformed as a multilateral development bank, Japan should join and US should join. But there are conditions. So it's like TPP in reverse, that if they have the good standards, then Japan and US should join.
Adam, what's your view on, because of course not just Japan that didn't join the AIIB, US as well.
As much as I like Taka's reversing the issue of standards that way, I'm actually more sympathetic to the questioner. I think the big mistake of the US wasn't so much to not join as to make this into something that actually mattered. It really doesn't. Okay, it only matters in the context of what I was saying earlier, the US failures to provide proper access and governance for the international financial system and proper funding and recycling of funds in Asia and Central Asia. This isn't the Asian Monetary Fund. This isn't something, competing conditionality in monetary affairs has a thing that sort of breaks down standards throughout the world. Lousy development lending is unfortunately all too common. And if the Chinese want to waste a bunch of money doing lousy development lending, I'd rather they didn't do it in an environmentally unfriendly way, but on the other hand, I'd rather they learn a lesson that throwing money at things isn't going to work so well, just as the US and Japan and others have learned through the years. So basically, I don't really care. We did a major event on the multilateral development banks at the Institute a few weeks ago and talked to this. There are actually, you mentioned one example, Taka mentioned EIB, there are actually over 50 of these kinds of things in the world, most of which we haven't heard of for good reason. And none of them are systemic or set a huge precedent for any of the others. The one thing I would say is the Asian Development Bank is actually a good institution. It is de facto Japan and US dominated. So it's understandable why the Chinese and others try to get around it. But let's be very clear here. The Asian Development Bank actually is working out a decent modus vivendi with the AIIB. And the person who's running the AIIB for China, Jin Li-kun, used to be a vice president at ADB. And the Japanese head of the ADB, former Vice Minister Nakao, is actually very sharp and very well respected in China as kind of a fair broker. So again, I take Taka's point, I take your point. I'd rather we just let this subside and let's just let it go forward. And if it screws up, let the Chinese learn something. And if it doesn't screw up, let the Americans and Japanese join. Let's just calm down about it.
Question over here.
John Wheeler. Just a follow-up question on the consumption tax. I was at an economic seminar yesterday on the Japanese economy, and two very prominent economic experts had a very lively debate on the consumption tax and what the implications would be. One, I guess, basically agreed with the panel, saying given Japan's deficit, it's absolutely essential that it be raised and continue to be raised in 2017. The other argued that no, that consumption was the main issue, and this was the most disastrous policy thing you could possibly do to have Japan grow in the future. That consumption is the key issue, and it was a mistake to raise it 8%. It's going to be a mistake to do it in 2017. I just wondered if you could counter that argument.
Can I go first on
Yeah,
this
please.
one? I mean, I'm seen by some of those people on that side as a prodigal son, because I was the one in 97, 98 arguing very much against that consumption tax rise, and did a lot of the academic work showing, contrary to people's expectations, that really was very harmful. And I came out, as Taka and others did, and said, no, I want the consumption tax rise to have gone through. And the reason I changed my mind is you know, as I guess Prime Minister Macmillan once famously said, events, dear boy, events. You know, it's now 18 years later. The Japanese situation is worse on the debt front, worse on the demographic front. They had the unfortunate shock, triple shock, of the Fukushima disaster. All this says that realistically they have less fiscal room to play now than they did 18 years ago. And therefore it is reasonable to reassess and say, while trading off the high short-term costs for long-term benefit in the midst of a terrible recession in 98 probably wasn't worth it, trading off the costs, the short-term costs for the long-term benefit in the midst of a very supportive monetary environment and much less room to fall back now is worth it. And I think people are just, I think the people are dogmatically saying, you know, because it's very costly in the short run, it can't be worth it, are mistaken in two senses. I mean, this is sort of how Paul set up the initial question. I know he doesn't believe this, but it's sort of, you know, you're either in the camp, this is horribly destructive, and therefore we shouldn't do it, or the consumption tax won't hurt at all, and therefore we should do it. I'm in the, it is going to hurt, but you have to do it anyway. And I think it's just the balance of costs and benefits on the hurt versus what you lose at this point is worse than it was 15 years ago.
Did you want to add to that? Tom?
Yeah. I'm going to turn around the question and ask to those who advocate no tax increase that will consumption rise if we don't raise taxes? There's no guarantee, right? The population is shrinking, and if their wages and wages are not rising, they will not raise consumption. So you wait consumption to come back, sharp increase, wait a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and may never come. Then we have the huge debt and fiscal crisis almost certainly come. That population is declining, which means that the market is shrinking, and we need innovation and other things to get the wages up and consumption to be sustained. But that's a different question from the tax increase. And we should be putting more efforts to those wage issues and labor market issues and the intergenerational issues that elderly, the retired, is taking more resources out of the young over the time, and we need to address that. So that's an important question. So in technically, we need to find out what the potential growth rate is. And if it's above the potential growth rate, which is, I would say, positive number, then we should be in the medium-term consolidation path.
Perhaps just to add, I'm sorry, just to add my perspective, because it's a little bit different from the panelists. A consumption tax hike is two things simultaneously. One is it's a fiscal reform to improve the fiscal system on the tax side in particular, but it also has a short-term effect on aggregate demand. It's a demand impacting measure as well. And so I think the debate is, in my mind, is all about the sequencing and the timing. And I would certainly, and this is probably where I would part a little bit with the panelists, put the priority on making sure that the economy is well out of deflation, is achieving the targets that were actually put into the consumption tax legislation as forward-looking targets on which the consumption tax hikes were being predicated, which is 3% nominal GDP growth, comprising 2% real and a 1% GDP deflator. And to see that on a more sustained basis, because I think the problem, I see ending deflation as the first step towards fiscal consolidation. So it's really more of a timing issue, just to give a different perspective. But I saw some hands go up. We've got 5 minutes left, so down here. Thank you.
Sheldon Kasowitz, Indus Capital Partners. Staying with the same topic and paraphrasing another Englishman, maybe we're arguing over price. You cite many studies and a general feeling in Japan that the rate should go to 20 to 25. I've seen numbers as high as 30 or 40, some arguments. And without getting too into the very detailed flows, there are moves afoot to tighten collections, mine number, and other measures that will have some positive effect. If one gets the 3 or 4% nominal growth, then you kind of let it run. During the Koizumi years, expenditures were basically held flat.
Right.
There are other ways to a fiscal consolidation, but it seems to me the presumption is 25%, or some number is the magic number. I'd like to hear both your comments on levels.
Let me give you my thing, and you're absolutely right. There are many ways to skin the cat. However, since you have to keep skinning the cat every year, it's a question of what causes the least loss of fur. Putting it a little more concretely, there are things going on and there are alternative means, right? So there is actually, and Taka didn't mention this, but there is actually a pretty significant change in the way pensions are being distributed, and the actual real value of pensions is going down the last few years, and they've changed the indexing rules. And going forward, that's going to make a material difference. There are a lot of things like that you can do. The problem is the Japanese state, as it stands, is actually relatively small as a share of the economy compared to most other economies. And to the degree it's going to rise, it's about looking after old people from a healthcare point of view. And you can force a certain amount of self-insurance and already do, but there are limits both on humanitarian and efficiency grounds to how far you want to go with that. And if you do want to raise military spending or self-defense spending, even a full % of GDP a year, you got to find the money for that somewhere else too. So by the time you do all that, it's like the issue with discretionary spending in the US budget, but even more so. There aren't that many things you can cut. You can be more miserly with pensions and with healthcare, and that'll matter. That'll cap future rises, but that's not going to save you that much now. And so this is why most people, myself included, end up coming back to a consumption tax. The consumption tax is not the best thing ever. And it certainly, and this is where I thought Paul was going to go, it certainly has, even though I agree with Taka, it's not clear that not raising the tax leads to a rise in consumption. It clearly, over time, will be something of a disincentive to consumption if you raise it a lot. So it's not ideal. But on a lot of other bases, it's efficient, it's easy to collect, it's easy to monitor, it's easy to implement, there's no delay. Everybody knows it's there. Once it's there, you can be sure that it's still there. There are a lot of reasons why, if you have to raise a lot of tax revenue, that's the way to go, and that's why people have kept doing it. Now, again, you can say, what's the right number? I choose to say minimum 20%, just because if you look at the numbers, you do need basically a rise in tax revenues on the order of 20, 30, 40% to make anything go. There just isn't enough other stuff there. You have to get that much more tax revenues. I think collection, there are differing estimates, but I don't think it gets you more than 5%. So then you're just left with what else can you do? And that's how you end up with the consumption tax.
Yeah.
Just a number, Tucker. I want to get one more question in if I can, so very brief.
So, Koizumi years, yes, the deficit has declined, but we are facing a much severe situation now that all the baby boomers, the age between 62 to 67 right now, are retiring in the next 5 years, and there'll be the other side of the fence, collecting pensions rather than paying in the contributions. So the times are different, and we need much more tax collections. How to get taxes from the retirees? Consumption tax. We cannot solve it with the labor.
But they're also
income tax.
living another 20 years, so maybe the idea would be not to retire and to
Well, they have
avoid that for a while.
forced retirement at age 65.
No, I'm saying maybe that should be changed.
I mean, yeah.
I had to come to U.S. to work, right?
It's true. On the other hand, let's be very clear, leaving Taka's personal situation out of it. If you don't have retirement age and you want to promote women and you want to give young people a chance in the seniority-based Japanese system, that's going to be awfully hard. So there is actually another argument for forcing some retirement in Japan.
If somebody's got a really quick question, we can sneak it in. No, yeah.
Nakayama City. The reform of the IMF and reform of ADB will make AIIB issue less important from your point of view.
Well, I think that was already what I said, so yes. Taka.
Yes.
Great. Short question, short answers. On that note, I'd like to bring the session to a close. I'd like to thank our panelists for a very insightful discussion. Thank the members for helping to make this a very lively and enjoyable session as well. A coffee reception is now going to follow outside. Hope that you can all join us for that. And then the second session will begin at 11 a.m. So if you could thank the panelists.